You are listening to Savage Bites, Season 2, Episode 24, Baby Doll Snap. The road ran arrow straight across the baking biscuit crust of the desert, a thread-like river of pale asphalt bisecting the desolate plain, receding into the west all the way to the bluff-studded horizon, its surface undulating gently in accord with the wrinkled topography, shimmering in the remorseless heat of a relentless afternoon sun. Away east, it was the same story, a narrow filament trailing away into the haze. In all that barren immensity, there was no visible sign of life, save for the sparse scattering of scrubby desert weeds that eked out a sullen existence in that arid wilderness. The stark loneliness of the place, the immemorial silence of it, was broken only by the ceaseless Brownian drone of insects. The Mustang squatted beside the road, low-slung and aggressive, tired out and dusty, a thin film of steam rising lazily from the popped front seam of the hood. There was movement from within, a muffled voice. The splayed hull shivered on stiff springs. Then the passenger door cracked and swung open, and a lithe female figure stumbled out into the dust. The oppressive heat of the desert hit her like the opening of an oven door. Squinting into the glare, she span on her heel. Consumed in a fit of impotent rage, glaring wild-eyed into the car's dim interior, she dragged her rucksack from the footwell, snarling vitriolically, a bitter smile animating her doll-like features.
That's just great, sure. Thanks a lot.
She went on in sneering, acerbic sarcasm.
I'll be honest, I'm impressed. You've outdone yourself this time. How thoughtful of you to decide that this picturesque location would be the perfect place to die on me.
Exasperated, she slammed the door, stumbling back a step with the momentum of the effort, as she hurled a clumsy kick against the now-closed door.
Ha! Serves you right anyway, you bastard!
Hefting the rucksack onto one slender shoulder, Jessica absent-mindedly rubbed something sticky off her palm onto the hip of her denim cutoffs as she squinted out over the desert. She wasn't lost as such, but she might as well be. It must be many miles to the next town, and she was already running late. Jessica had always hated Mark's car. It was old, really old, probably a fucking antique or something for all she knew. It had covered a lot of miles, and was in her view worn out, though Mark, her boyfriend, had spent a small fortune in its painstaking restoration. The worn leather seats were hot and sticky and uncomfortable, and the air conditioning was faulty and had worked only intermittently since he'd bought the damn thing 4 years before. As bad as it was in her eyes, the old Mustang had been Mark's pride and joy. She was convinced, and had been for some time, that he loved that car more than he loved her. He certainly spent more time on it, and more money, and treated it a downside better too. That's why she'd wanted to take it. She knew it would needle him, like nothing else. And she had justified it to herself, quietly satisfied that it would go some way to compensate her, and would serve him right, at least in part, for the way he'd made her suffer. Screw him, he was an asshole, and she was finally done with him and his bullshit and his lies and his violent fucking temper. She bit her lip at the thought of that. That had been the worst part, and she shivered, despite the heat, at the memory of his outbursts. Those memories dwelt near at hand, always waiting at the edge of her cognizance, always poised for recollection. A violent kaleidoscopic montage of incidents whose discrete elements were lost in a miasma of booze and drugs and sexual debauchery. They aggregate, all integrated into a single boiling mass of rabid violence. The sum of them all coalesced into an overwhelmingly oppressive atmosphere of wild, panicked fear that had for so long served to corral her, to hold her as a hostage, inert, a prisoner to his rage and to the fearful prospect of further abuse. But all that was over. She was done with Las Vegas too. It had been fun for a while, or seemed so, but sooner or later Vegas either cuts you loose or kills you, and Jessica didn't want to stick around for that fate to catch up with her, hypnotized like a moth to the flame by the glittering neon and the glamour and that always just out of reach promise of the big score. She'd done it. She'd made the break, got out. She turned her last trek, endured her last lap dance, shaking her tits and her tight little ass for another in a long line of fat, faceless, drunken idiots, gamblers, bachelor party goers and birthday boys, perverts and convention delegates, each of them thrilled at that momentary liberation from the monotony of life, from the loneliness or the stifling confines of a soured marriage, from kids and pension payments and the slow soul death of salaried servitude. She'd sold her young body for the last time. No longer would she soil herself to line the pockets of that abusive bastard. Fuck that life, and fuck Mark. She smiled to herself at the thought of that. No, she'd never fuck Mark again. That bastard had had his last slice of her sweet ass. She was done. She crouched beside the Mustang, glancing into the wing mirror, leaning in anxiously, lightly touching the fresh bruise that purpled the smooth skin below her left eye. No more rough stuff, she thought, catching her own eye in the glass and shaking her head. Not anymore. The sole of her boot scuffed the asphalt, kicking up dust, sending a scattering of gravel chips skipping off the surface into the dry weeds. Jessica was dog-tired, and as she walked, an open blister stung the heel of her right foot with every step. Her hips were sore, her shoulder too, where the strap of the rucksack etched a cleft into the supple flesh near the bone. She hefted its weight, shifting its position slightly, the action granting but a moment's relief. She'd been walking along the crumbling edge of this godforsaken back road for what felt like forever. Nothing, not one solitary vehicle, had passed her by in all that time. Now the sun was dipping, and behind her in the east, the sky began to acquire a darkling hue. There had been a shallow sea here once, an aquatic realm alive and vital, haunted by strange sleek forms that hunted and glided through a prehistoric interstices of balmy blue. The dramatic interplay of predation and evasion, of deceit and betrayal, the life and death struggle that formed the fabric of those primitive lives was lost now, lost far back in the tracks of the great wheel of time, all played out 100 million years before. The fossilized remains of that outmoded biosphere were all that remained, fragmented, scattered and broken, worn down by time's relentless pestle, and sown in ubiquitous profusion, intermingled with the desert sands. The gas station rose out of the brush-speckled plain, clear-cut against an iron blue sky, like a sun-bleached skeleton quivering in the blinding glare of the sinking sun. The single, lonely gas pump stood silhouetted against the sky beneath the perforated carcass of the overhead canopy. At one time it had gleamed glossily in metallic candy apple red. Now time and the desert wind had dulled its luster to the colour of rancid pork. Its worn surface pitted with rust, its glass filler gauge milky with a million wind-blown dust scratches, the chrome-plated nozzle flaking and peeling where it hung in its hook, its rubber hose cracked and grey. The station building grovelled some distance behind it, set back from the road across a weed-littered patch of cracked concrete, partly concealed by encroaching creosote and rabbit brush. It had at some point been half-heartedly boarded up, perhaps in the hope of some subsequent return, but that had never happened, and now it was just another derelict, forgotten by its keeper, and left to the mercy of the wind. There was a tumble-down outhouse too, and the last creaking remnants of a clapboard barn, beside which slouched the fossilized shell of a 1968 Chevrolet Impala. When she'd first caught sight of it, her heart had raced at the prospect of rescue, of something cool to quench her raging thirst, of rest in the shade and a ride to the nearest town. Now Jessica could see, as she drew nearer, that the place was deserted and dead, and her heart sank. The place had stood here since the 1950s. Business had been brisk in those optimistic post-war years when the American dream was at its height and the automobile symbolized the freedom and individuality of the age. That all changed when the interstate cut through 30 miles to the south. The traffic went with it, siphoning off the flow of the financial faucet that had sustained the place, that had made it a thriving little business. With its customers gone and starved of income, the gas station died a slow, painful death, dried up, desiccated and windblown. Its existence had been fleeting, a mere flicker of human activity in comparison with the epoch-spanning persistence of the immutable desert around it. It had animated that little patch of barren ground for but an instant before dying away, leaving nothing behind but another decaying fossil, abandoned and lost in time. Jessica wasn't sure how much longer she could go on in the heat, and had determined to wait out the rest of the day in the shade of the gas station's dilapidated awning and continue her journey by starlight, reckoning that, despite the darkness, as long as she kept to the road, she couldn't go too far wrong. Lost in thought, she was oblivious to the drone of the approaching engine until it was almost upon her. The big burbling V8 slowing to idle as the Mustang glided past her shoulder and drew to a gentle halt just up ahead, its fat tyres crunching in the fine gravel at the roadside. She stopped in her tracks in bewilderment at the sight of that enigmatic machine, just sitting there in the glare of the late afternoon sun, the desert air shimmering over the hood, its motor idling with a deep pulsating thrum like the low warning growl of a jungle cat. "Going my way." The low voice was familiar, characterized by that edge of sardonic confidence that had at one time thrilled her, but now just left her cold and afraid.
What the hell are you doing here?"
Jessica challenged, her voice shrill with astonishment and ill-concealed fear. Mark glared out at her through the Mustang's open passenger window. His eyes were dark, hooded in shadow beneath heavy brows, the pupils gleaming in the dim cockpit of the car. "Don't be that way, baby doll." His voice was deep and measured, but something in the timbre denoted a hint of barely contained rage. "Won't you get in?" he urged, leaning over easily and unlatching the door. Jessica hesitated, stricken by existential confusion and claustrophobic fear. She gazed out at the empty vastness of the surrounding desert as though seeking an answer to an incomprehensible question, a warm zephyr shifting the hair about her shoulders. What choice did she have, though? Keep walking? God only knew how far she'd have to go before she got picked up, or came across some sign of habitation. Mark was a bastard, no doubt, but right now she needed to be practical, and she was already behind schedule. The door thudded shut behind her.
"How did you find me?"
Jessica inquired wearily.
"And how the hell did you get that car running?"
Mark smiled wolfishly, slotting the stick into first, pausing to hold her gaze in silence for a heartbeat before speaking. "I'm like the Lord. I move in mysterious ways." He winked at her then, and she felt her skin crawl. This had been a bad idea, and she was suddenly overcome with a desperate longing to get away, but it was too late for that. The Mustang's V8 roared, and behind them the fat tyres kicked up a rooster tail of dust. The car lurched forward, scrambling back onto the road and briskly gathered pace, heading westward. They sat quietly for a space, each lost in their own private thoughts. Mark eyed her continually, one heavy hand resting casually on the wheel, the speedometer needle steady at 55. At length, he spoke. "Why'd you do it, baby doll? Why'd you cut loose and leave me without so much as a by your leave?" His upper lip twitched with restrained enmity. She knew the hurt he felt was genuine, that somewhere beneath his battle-tested armour of callous conceit lay a frightened and abandoned little boy, but none of that mattered, and she steeled herself against her natural soft-hearted tendencies. That little boy had the body and strength of a man, bent to a sadistic will with a vicious willingness to abrogate all his latent insecurities in a violent rage. Jessica stammered, afraid and confused, uncertain of what to say, how to frame a reply that would placate his temper, that might lessen the chance of yet another savage beating.
I just needed a little time, you know?
She smiled weakly, aspiring to sound calm and casual, but the fear caught in her throat, constricting it, lifting the tonality of her voice half an octave, her words cracking and breaking. He ignored her. "You hurt me bad, baby doll. You cut me deep." He glared at her again with those darkly gleaming eyes. "Real deep." Jessica laughed nervously, harnessing as best she could, in light of her fear, all the guile and persuasion she could muster.
"You're adorable. You know I could never leave you. You know that I love you."
She smiled coquettishly, and the effect was breathtaking. She was beautiful and erotic all at once. Any red-blooded male would feel the hot cocktail thrill and stab of adrenaline-spiked dopamine at those words directed at him from a woman like her. There was a sudden blinding flash of bright white, and the stinging shock of pain as hard knuckles split the thickest part of her full lower lip. "Shut the fuck up, you lying bitch," he snarled through tight, spittle-flecked lips. "You think I give a fuck about that bullshit? You're coming back with me, back to the strip, and back to work. You're gonna make me $1 million before you're all used up." He glanced at her, his eyes all aflame with self-righteous hostility. "Who the fuck do you think you are, huh? Let me disabuse you of any doubts. You're a whore, nothing more. And you're my whore, and you do whatever the fuck I say. Is that crystal fucking clear, Jessica?" Her back was wedged against the door, her knees pulled up into the fetal position, recoiling from him. The heel of her boot drove abruptly into the edge of his jaw, slamming his head against the door pillar, momentarily dazing him. Then she was on him, biting and scratching, polished nails clawing at those gleaming dark eyes. Neither of them spoke, neither shouted. That brief melee was fought out in silence, save for the coarse whisper of their breath as they struggled. It was primal, a panting, grunting union in violent exertion. It was almost sexual, a fight not simply for dominance or freedom. This time it was all in. This time it was a fight for survival. The unattended car weaved erratically, crossed the median line and left the road, rolling to a bumpy halt among the desert brush. There was a spatter of blood inside the compartment, and a desperate, choking, gurgling cry. Then the driver's door was open, and she was forcing him out into the dust. Before she knew it, she was alone in the driver's seat, her chest heaving with the effort of the clash, tears streaming down her mascara-stained cheeks, and the car was gathering pace, heading westward once more. It was several minutes before she noticed the bloody pair of hairdressing scissors clutched white-knuckle tight in her right hand. Jessica wasn't sure how long she'd been driving, or whether she'd been driving at all. Her perception of time seemed askew, her mind stalled, locked in recollection of that last terrible interaction with him, yet at the same time avoiding it. It was a black hole at the center of a universe of anxiety, blotting out the graphic images that jostled for attention at the edge of her subconscious mind, sights that threatened to overwhelm her in guilt and panic. The Mustang hunkered at the side of the road, the fuel gauge at empty. It was a long time before she moved, peeling sticky hands from the steering wheel and popping the driver door, clambering out of that now impotent hulk and mechanically slinging the blood-stained rucksack across her shoulder. The sun was dipping in the west, taking the edge off the heat of the day. A cool wind stirred her hair as she began to walk, her boots scuffing in the dust, her mind blank. An hour later, she was still walking. Far ahead in the west, the blush ball of the setting sun pinked the distant haze. In its glow, a familiar form stood proud above the barren plain, silhouetted darkly against the broad coral sky. A gas station. Jessica quickened her pace, eager to reach this new oasis of hope. But as she drew nearer, that fresh fervent hope began to die, and her pace slackened. No, it wasn't a gas station. It was the gas station. The derelict skeleton she'd passed hours before. It was unmistakable, every detail exactly as she remembered it. The solitary gas pump beneath the awning, the dilapidated buildings, and the rusted shell of the old car. How could this be? What had happened? Jessica paused, sweeping back her tousled hair, rubbing her tired eyes. She was confused and exhausted, and beginning to doubt her own senses. She didn't hear the Mustang till it drew to a halt beside her, the familiar deep burbling note of the idling V8 sending a thrill of fearful apprehension through her heart. Slowly she turned her head, half hypnotized by the outre surrealism of her predicament. He was there in the driver's seat, black eyes gleaming in the dark. "You hurt me bad, baby doll." As he spoke, she caught the glossy sheen of blood flowing freely from the tattered tear in his throat. The flesh around it punctured and puckered where she'd driven the scissors into him again and again. "You cut me real deep." Her vision swam abruptly, the scene before her distending in crash-zoomed distortion, driving her headlong down a narrowing tunnel of hazy shadow. There were tears, and a hopeless cry of desperate anguish. Then blackness. The buzzing of insects brought her back from the void of sleep. When she came to, she was stiff and sore, lying prone in the dust beside the Mustang, her head aching, her lip thickened and stinging. The bloody scissors still clutched in her rigid right hand. The passenger door of the Mustang hung open, and within she could see, half silhouetted in the gloom, Mark's dead body. The tattered rent in his throat was alive and crawling, enhaloed in a lazy, shifting swarm of fat black flies. Disgusted and appalled, she scrambled to her feet, retching dryly, sickened by the sight of him and by the budding aroma of decay. Distractedly dragging the rucksack across her shoulder, she staggered away up the track, her eyes locked on that grim diorama as it slowly receded. Mark was dead. She'd killed him. Somehow, at some point amid the struggle, she'd found the scissors in her hand and used them, plunging the slender steel into his throat again and again in a frenzy of panicked fear. She hadn't wanted to hurt him, hadn't intended for him to die. All she'd wanted was to get away, for him not to hurt her, not again, and she had done what she had to prevent it. It had been self-defense, she knew that. Anyone could see that. But she couldn't shake the guilt from her mind, and the sight of that bloody ruin of flesh kept forming and reforming in her mind's eye, no matter how she strove to dismiss it. It was hot, oppressively hot, the afternoon sun baking the arid biscuit crust of the desert as it had for 1,000,000 years, and would do for 1,000,000 more for all Jessica knew. It stretched, endless and empty and hostile, to the bluff-studded horizon, like the surface of some parched alien planet. A planet devoid of life, save for her, the last sentient creature in all creation. She didn't know how long she'd been walking when the Mustang drew level with her, its fat tires crunching in the dust, the V8 burbling at idle, those eyes gleaming within the darkened interior. When at length he spoke, she found that the familiar tone of sardonic conceit was gone, replaced with an inflection of bitter self-pity. "You hurt me bad, baby doll. You cut me deep." You have been listening to Baby Doll Snap, Episode 24 of Savage Bites. Written, illustrated, narrated and produced by Christian Bravery. If you enjoyed this episode, then maybe you could hit the like button. And if you haven't done so already, please subscribe. Something like 60% of my listeners aren't subscribed yet to the channel. If that's you, then subscribing to the channel and hitting that notification bell will ensure that you'll know whenever I upload new content. This episode concludes Season 2 of Savage Bites. For the next few weeks, I'll be focusing on writing the second draft of my dark speculative fiction novel, Lithe. But I'll still be making regular uploads to the channel, with further episodes of Masters of Weird Volume 1, with a select series of classic weird fiction tales from H.P. Lovecraft, H.G. Wells, and several others. And you can expect Season 3 of Savage Bites to come slavering out of the darkness with more original horror fiction at the beginning of October. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.